About it such a slow news week. So on a day that's been dominated by a certain former president who was indicted, I'm here to talk about the other guy. Does anybody remember Joe Biden? In any case, I promise I'll be done in time for everybody to go home for Trump's press conference at 8:15 from Mar-a-Lago. I'm sure no one wants to miss it. That's at 8:15, and our hard out is 8, so nobody has to worry. This is my third book about powerful people in Washington, and people have asked me, how do you get them to talk? So I'll tell you the backstory. It began almost 13 years ago when I got a call from the great filmmaker Jules Naudet. I had left ABC News, and Jules wanted to know if I would partner with him on a documentary about White House chiefs of staff. His wife Jacqueline is here with us tonight. Anyway, Jules, there was a challenge. And the first challenge was, how do you get a home address for Dick Cheney? Well, my wife Carrie went online and came back about an hour later, and she said, I've got it. I said, I've got what? She said, Dick Cheney's home address. I said, where'd you get it? She said, warcriminals.org. So that was the first big research breakthrough, and it's been smooth sailing since then. So why did I write a book about Joe Biden's White House? The answer is, how could I not? I mean, Joe Biden and his team came into office facing the most daunting challenges since Franklin Roosevelt's presidency: a once-in-a-century pandemic, a crippled economy, racial injustice, global warming, all that. Well, and of course, the aftermath of an attempted insurrection incited by the guy who got indicted today. All that before a Russian tyrant invaded a democracy in the heart of Europe. The truth is that even at the 2-year mark, this is the most consequential presidency of my lifetime. My first two books, The Gatekeepers on the White House Chiefs and The Spy Masters on the CIA directors, covered cumulatively something like 100 years. This book covers 2, and yet this was more difficult. This was the bigger challenge. Writing a book about a White House in progress is a little bit like trying to design an airplane in mid-flight. You're getting buffeted by a COVID variant on one side, and then an unexpected invasion of Ukraine on the other, and you just hope, you have no idea where you're going to land. You just hope you can land the plane safely. And compounding the difficulty, this is the most battened down, disciplined, leak-proof, on-script White Houses in modern history. Joe Biden's advisors don't give many interviews, much less speak out of school. So why did they talk to me? Maybe because this White House has a story to tell that's more important than the one we're all watching now, involving hush money and porn stars. I really see the fight of his life as a kind of political thriller in 3 acts. The first act was the unbelievably fraught transition from the Trump White House to Biden, the most contentious, and as it turned out, the bloodiest since the Civil War. It's the almost unbelievable story of how an obscure Trump White House official, a deputy White House chief of staff, carried out a sub rosa operation under Trump's nose and without his knowledge. This official kept the wheels of the transition turning. He thought about resigning every time Trump said something autocratic, but his friends talked him off the ledge, telling him, you can't quit because someone has to ensure the peaceful transfer of power. The second act was the first year of Biden's presidency, which was overshadowed by the botched evacuation of Afghanistan and, of course, a steady decline in Biden's approval rating. We forget now that, Biden's presidency was on the verge of failure. In late October of 2021, At the low point of the Biden presidency, I went to visit Ron Klain, his chief of staff at the White House. The president had just left for Europe and the climate conference in Glasgow. He tried to pass his Build Back Better legislation and bipartisan infrastructure bills, but had nothing to show for it. Biden had even mused aloud on camera that the fate of his presidency depended on passing those bills, but they were dead in the water. And so I sat on the patio of just outside Ron Klain's West Wing office, and he confessed to me that he was considering quitting. This was 9 months into Biden's presidency. After talking it over with his wife, he decided to stay on. And believe me, Joe Biden, I think, is grateful that he did. The third act of this political thriller, I feel, began on February 24, 2022, when Vladimir Putin launched the invasion of Ukraine. This was the turning point of the Biden presidency, in my view, and in contrast to the Afghan evacuation, this time everyone did almost everything right. Unlike his predecessors, this president had no illusions about Vladimir Putin. Joe Biden never looked into the Russian dictator's eyes and saw his soul. In the walk-up to the invasion, Biden's National Security Council and State Department performed brilliantly, and it was also the CIA's finest hour, comparable to its remarkable performance in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when the CIA had blueprints of Russian missile sites on the island. U.S. intelligence had Putin dead to rights. They knew exactly what he was up to, and CIA Director Bill Burns paid a secret visit to Volodymyr Zelensky and shared the blueprint of the invasion, of the Russian invasion plans. Behind closed doors, Biden and Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, warned Western allies about the invasion to come. But the whole enterprise was touch and go. NATO leaders weren't buying it. Even Zelensky was unconvinced. And on the eve of the invasion, I write about this scene when Kamala Harris met with Zelensky at the Munich Security Conference. She told him not only were the Russians coming for Ukraine, they were coming for him and his wife and his family. Zelensky was still unconvinced. And as he left, the vice president turned to an aide and said, "I wonder if that's the last time we'll see him alive." Timing is everything in politics and among presidencies. Joe Biden was wholly unprepared to be president in 1988 and 2008, his two previous failed campaigns. But in 2020, when an authoritarian president refused to leave office peacefully, Biden was the right person at the right time. And 2 years later, when Putin invaded Ukraine, Biden was uniquely qualified to rally NATO and the Western world. He spent decades preparing for that moment. But you know, my favorite parts of the book are the glimpses of Biden in his private, unguarded moments. It's what he really thinks of the vice president and his Secret Service detail and living in the White House and the press corps. It's the chip he carries on his shoulder. You know, one of his aides once said that Joe Biden is the only Irishman who doesn't carry grudges. I am here to tell you that that is not the case. Believe it or not, Biden is still pissed off at Averell Harriman. Harriman was FDR's patrician friend, ambassador to the Soviet Union, and a railroad magnate. He was the gatekeeper to the Washington establishment, and one day, Harriman summoned a young Senator Joe Biden to his Georgetown study, where he interrogated him about foreign affairs. He thought I didn't know the answers, Biden complained bitterly. 5 decades later, Biden can barely remember Harriman's name, but he still complains about that rich guy, the railroad guy. And Biden doesn't forgive people who fail to take him seriously. That includes a couple of Obama's advisors named Axelrod and Pluff, for example, who doubted that Joe Biden was presidential material. One of the president's close friends told me he hates the Davids. The truth is that Joe Biden has been underestimated time and time and time again in his political career. In the third act of his presidency, he passed a string of bipartisan legislative bills, culminating in the landmark Inflation Reduction Act. It's a legislative record that rivals LBJ's and achieved with a razor-thin Democratic majority. And yet, as the midterm elections of November 2022 approached, all the experts said that Biden and his party would be routed. Remember that by the GOP? They predicted a loss of 40 or more seats in the House. And this is where Biden was well served by a chief of staff named Ron Klain. The president wanted to go everywhere and talk about everything. Understandably, he wanted to brag about his accomplishments in the walk up to the midterms. Klain sat the boss down, as only a White House chief of staff can do, and said, Mr. President, you're going to go to the states where you can make a difference, and you're going to talk about women's reproductive rights and the threats posed by the MAGA movement to democracy. Well, we all know how that turned out. The Democrats defied expectations of the GOP rout, holding the Senate and losing just a handful of seats in the House. At 1:16 a.m. on election night, Klain sent me an unsolicited email. It read, "Maybe we don't suck as much as people thought." One of those unscripted moments that every author lives for. As an email like that in the middle of the night. I had turned in and of course didn't reply until the morning. But for all the challenges Biden faced in his first 2 years, now comes the hard part. An octogenarian, he faces a bruising re-election battle. And by the way, he's running. I'm here to tell you. Andy Card, George W. Bush's chief, once told me something that rang true. He said, if anybody ever tells you they're leaving the White House voluntarily, they're probably lying to you. Presidents don't give up power easily, as we learned all too horrifically in 2020. And, the last president to do so was Lyndon Johnson in 1968. Of course, Biden will be 82 in 2024 and 86 by the end of a second term if he gets one. So how old is too old to run for re-election? Card told me that he favors a constitutional amendment that would prohibit anyone from running for president beyond the age of 75. I'm 75, he said, and I'm not as sharp as I used to be. But Jack Watson, Jimmy Carter's last chief, who was 84, told me that aging is a very individual thing. It affects everyone differently. Many Supreme Court justices, John Marshall, Felix Frankfurter, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, were firing on every cylinder well into their 80s. Pablo Picasso had his most productive period before he died at the age of 91. Warren Buffett is doing fine in his 90s. So Watson argues that the voters should decide. And that makes sense to me. Over the next 2 years, Biden faces a daunting to-do list. He must fend off a hostile Republican majority in the House that is hell-bent on bringing him down. He must implement the legislative accomplishments of his first 2 years because none of them matter until the rubber meets the road. He's got to keep the West united against Putin, even as that alliance shows signs of fraying. He must try to make sure that Israel doesn't slide into autocracy and the West Bank doesn't explode into a third intifada. He's got to tame inflation and avoid a possible recession. And perhaps most important of all, Biden must deal with the continuing threat of Donald Trump. The thing that shocked Joe Biden more than anything else during his presidency was the lasting power of Trumpism. He couldn't wrap his head around it. He thought Trump would be in the rearview mirror long ago. He'd won by 7 million votes. He thought he had a mandate. But Trump hasn't gone anywhere. And like it or not, in 2024, as in 2020, Biden and his team believe that the 45th president will be the GOP nominee, notwithstanding what happened today with 34 counts, felony counts against him. And this time, Biden believes not just the presidency, but democracy will be on the ballot. One thing is clear, as the Biden presidency enters its fourth act, it's a political thriller with no ending yet. And with that, I'd be happy to take your questions.